Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
So the next chapter in Dr. Gonzalez's work is on the teachers of the church. Most of the early writings that we have dealt with single specific issues. So that, for instance, Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Why did Paul write his letter to the Corinthians? Because he had visited the Corinthians, and now after he left, he heard that they were doing some things like excluding people from the Eucharist with which he did not agree. And so he wrote his letter to the Corinthians simply to address specific issues like that. So here we had all of these writings during the first centuries that were just dealing with one issue at a time. Gnosticism, if we remember that last time, that was the belief that certain people have special knowledge, right? That someone in this crowd, Janie, could speak up and say, God spoke to me and said that we need to do this. Okay, that was Gnosticism. As an early church, we had to decide, okay, do we do what Janie says God told her that we need to do? Or do we do what we as a church come to a consensus that we should do? That was a big question for us. And that's why in 1870, that's why so many bishops left the Roman Catholic Church over the issue of papal infallibility, because they saw papal infallibility as falling back into that era, that heresy of Gnosticism that we had condemned. That one person could say, this is the truth, and everyone else suddenly looks around and says, okay, that's the truth. That was Gnosticism. We condemned that in the early church. So in the beginning of the church, we wrote treatises, books to deal with single issues, but we didn't have a comprehensive teaching of everything that the church believed yet. Now what we're going to find is that certain heresies come up, we're going to have to counter them and say, this is what we believe. So if Marcion is teaching one thing, okay, the question is Marcion right? Or do we, if not, then we better write what it is that we believe. Does that make sense? So most of the early writings simply dealt with single specific issues rather than expound the totality of Christian doctrines. But now by the end of the 2nd century, so around the year 200, by the year 200, we're going to have this controversy with Marcion and with the Gnostics, who have their own systems of doctrines, their own beliefs, and so we would have to define ourselves against them. We needed to have our own response. We needed to be able to outline what is Orthodox Christian belief. Have we heard that word orthodox before? Ortho comes from a Greek word meaning straight. Dox really comes from doxos, which means right praise, that we're praying in the right way. But orthodox is generally this word which means that if you are orthodox, then you are the right believing church. We have the orthodox faith. We have the right faith. So the question becomes, are you orthodox? Are you part of what the church really believes, or are you not? Which is why the split in 1054 was so important. In 1054, what was the split between two churches? The winning church got the name the Orthodox Catholic Church. What were the losers in that fight called? Roman Catholics. Yikes, that was a slap in the face. Why? Because to be Roman Catholic meant that you followed the Bishop of Rome, that you followed this one man, rather than be part of the Orthodox, right-believing church. So the whole concept of orthodoxy is something that's going to spring up now at the end of the 2nd century, because we have to decide who is orthodox, who believes the right thing, and who is a heretic. Those are pretty strong words, because what's going to happen is from the 2nd century on, we're going to start using words like orthodox or words like heretic as labels for churches and peoples, and those are going to influence history.
So you're either orthodox or a heretic.
You're either orthodox or you're heretic. And the heretics then are going to be the schismatics, who are going to create schisms within the church. Some of which we'll learn about this evening. Others we've already heard about. The Gnostics, for instance, okay? We have to decide, are our Gnostic brothers and sisters who believe that God speaks to Janie and Janie has the truth, are our Gnostic brothers and sisters orthodox? Do they believe what we believe? Or are they heretics? Are they outside the church? Because what's going to happen is the church is going to split. Some of them are going to go with us, the Orthodox Church. But let's just be honest. Some of us are going to be Gnostics and continue to believe that God is speaking through Janie. So there are going to be these splits, and being human beings, we know how it is in our own families, right? These little squabbles occur, and it influences history in our family for a long time. Same in the church. The church is going to have its share of squabbles. So we had to define our own systems of doctrines. We needed to have our own response, outlining orthodox belief. What is it that all of us believe so that we can test anyone else against that? And if anyone else comes into our midst, right? If Rafaela moves in from another church, we can tell whether she's orthodox or not based on whether she believes what we believe. And if not, there are two options. Either you can come to believe what we believe, or you're not part of us. Irenaeus of Lyon, we credit Irenaeus with really writing the first systematic work on our faith. So before Irenaeus, we were just writing works that dealt with singular issues. Irenaeus now is going to be one who comes along and who tries to pull together the things of our faith, what it is that we believe. He was a native of Asia Minor, a disciple of Polycarp. We remember that Polycarp was one of the martyrs who gave his life witnessing to the faith. He migrated to Lyon, which is in modern-day France. We've heard the word Lyon before because that's where the Second Council of Lyon in 1274 formulated purgatory. Any belief in purgatory comes from the Second Council of Lyon in 1274. So that's where he went in modern-day France. He became a presbyter, which today we know of as priests, and was sent to Rome. Later, he went back and was elected bishop of Lyon. Let's pause for a moment. He was what? Bishop of Lyon? He was elected. How did you become a bishop back then? Did other bishops from other places not come together and appoint you a bishop of the community? No. The bishops were elected by whom? By the people. So what a change in church history. In the very beginning then, for the first centuries, bishops were elected by the people. So what would happen is we would elect a bishop among us, Andy, Bishop Andy. We elect him. He is all right with being bishop. What he does then is he writes out what he believes. We share that with other bishops. And those who believe what he believes will come and consecrate him bishop. So far so good? So that Andy then is a sign of their communion with Andy. Those bishops who believe the same thing that he believes will take Andy, who is elected by our community, and consecrate him as a bishop of the church. So Irenaeus, we have two works that survive. One is his demonstration of apostolic preaching, which for our purposes is a little less important than the other one, Against Heresies, which is simply his work now trying to refute Gnosticism. And if you want to read more about that work, he summarizes all of Christian thought in that work, Against Heresies. So what happens is, I put the page numbers at pages 83 to 85 in Dr. Gonzalez's work, so that if you want to actually read what it is that he was writing about, you can see what it is that he believed about God and about Jesus and about Christ's death and resurrection. He sets forth, this is what we believe as Christians. Wow, how refreshing, because before Irenaeus, did we have anything like that? No. The modern day equivalent would be the Catechism. So we're all familiar, for instance, with catechisms. The last catechism published by the Roman Catholic Church was from the early 1990s, written by a cardinal in the church whose name was Joseph Ratzinger. Have we heard that name before?
Yeah.
He would later become Pope Benedict XVI. Interesting. He's the one who wrote the book saying, this is what Roman Catholics believe. Wow. If you want to be an Orthodox or right-believing Roman Catholic, this is what Roman Catholics believe. How interesting that one person could write what it is that all Roman Catholics believe on any subject. Interesting. That's the danger of catechisms. But it was Irenaeus who wrote one of the early catechisms, if you will, saying what it is that we believe as Christians. That was Irenaeus. Now we have Clement of Alexandria. Where is Alexandria located? Alexandria is a city located in present-day Egypt. Why is Alexandria so important? Because there were early centers in the church, so that back at the time we were talking about the Bishop of Rome being the first among equals, there were initially 4 patriarchs of the church. Where were those 4 patriarchs located? Around the Mediterranean. One was down here in Jerusalem. further up in the north was Antioch, where Paul based his missionary activities. So we had a patriarch in Antioch, a patriarch in Jerusalem, a patriarch over in Rome, which was very far from the others, and then a patriarch down here in Alexandria. And Alexandria is important because it's at the mouth of the Nile in Egypt. So Alexandria is in Africa, and actually Rome is much farther over to the left, which is why we often refer to Rome as the Western Church, and the other patriarchs as representing the Eastern Church. So Alexandria then, what's happening in Alexandria is we have Clement in Alexandria, which was a center of learning. Alexandria had the largest library on earth at that time. If you are interested in studying, being a scholar of any type, Alexandria is a good place to be. So we see that he lived roughly from 150 to 215 AD. He was likely born in Athens, which we know is in Greece, which is where Paul went and preached during his missionary journeys. The child of pagan parents, and was the main Christian instructor in Alexandria until 202 when persecution broke out. And how did he respond? Did he stand up for his faith? Clement was one who got out of town. Better for me to continue living and instructing Christians than to die here today. Right? Convinced that there is one truth, Clement tried to show that Christian doctrine is supported by Plato's philosophy. Think about that for a moment. We just finished a course on ancient philosophy. So which is right? Is ancient philosophy right, or is Christianity right? What was Clement's view on it? They're both right. They're both talking about the same truths. So if you want to learn truth, you can learn truth by reading these philosophers from Greece, or you can learn the truth from these scriptures written down here in the Holy Land. They both contain truth. They're both talking about the same God. The philosophers called that God the ineffable one, the unmoved mover, the good with the capital G. We remember all those words that we use to God. That is the same God that we Christians worship. Ooh, that's going to be interesting because that's going to take us down a different path. They say, once you believe that the philosophers believe that God is the most perfect thing that you can imagine. God is absolute perfection. Ooh, it's going to start introducing ideas that we didn't find in the Bible. Right? It's going to be written from a different perspective and a different culture. So it's going to be fascinating to see how it is that these develop. But Clement is going to try to convince us that philosophy and Christianity, we all are talking about the same truth. Those content, this is a fascinating line. He said, those content with literal interpretation of scriptures are like children content with milk. Think about this for a moment. So there's so many stories in scriptures, and what Clement was trying to say is there are different ways to interpret those stories, right? You can interpret those stories literally, that Jesus literally walked on water in the same way that I'm walking on this floor. One step at a time, Jesus walked on water and stood on water like I'm standing on this floor. You can interpret it literally, or you can find deeper meanings. What does he say about those who interpret the scriptures merely literally? They're like children content with milk. Do you remember St. Paul's analogy? St. Paul says, when I was a child, I drank milk. What happened when I got older? I started eating meat. Ooh. Think about that for a moment. When we learn Bible stories, Rafaela, during our Children's Liturgy of the Word, what is she teaching them? She's teaching them all sorts of great Bible stories. How are the children understanding them? More than likely, literally. That's what we do as children, right? So when Raphael tells us about Noah getting into this boat and getting 2 animals of every kind and then being in the boat for 40 days, etc., etc., I mean, as children we understand these things literally. That all of the animals on the earth were destroyed except for 2 of each. Whoa, that was a great story Raphael told us last week in the Liturgy of the Word, right? We understand them literally. Clement is saying, you know what? For those who are content with that, it's like children with milk. It's great, right? It's that person taking that story at his or her level. But then as we start to really study these things, Clement being in the center of Alexandria, where all these scholars and where it was known for its study, he's simply trying to tell us, the more that we study, the more we look for meat. The more we come to these theological classes, the less we're content with taking things literally and more simply, and the more we're looking for meat. Why are we here this evening? We're looking for some meat. Clement of Alexandria, he also said, faith is the starting point on which reason builds. So there's this age-old question, is it faith or reason? Which should we have as Christians? Should our whole life be based on faith? Or does reason somehow enter into this? So Jesus walked on water. I don't know how he did it, but you just have to believe. You have to have faith. What does reason tell us? Reason tells us, maybe we want to ask questions like, who told that story and why did they tell that story? If we believe that the Bible is not a book of history, but a book of theology, then the person who wrote that story was trying to tell us about God, that Jesus was God. That's the point of the story. The story of Jesus walking on water and telling a storm to be quiet. Why did that person write that story? They're trying to tell us that Jesus is God. So there has to be some reason in our faith as well. We don't live just by faith. We don't live just by reason alone. It's somehow this mixture of faith and reason. Think about that for a moment. So that dates back to the likes of Clement of Alexandria. So he says, people who don't use reason to build upon faith are like what? We've heard it before. Children content with milk. But you just have to believe. You just have to believe. Jesus walked on water. Just have to believe it. Okay? That's one stage of understanding the stories. Essentially what he's trying to say then is that yes, faith is absolutely necessary, but reason is also important in our faith. We can't say things that are so outlandish that persons of reason are just going to laugh us out as they laughed Paul out of town, right? What, a crucified criminal is God? That's a funny one, right? So our faith has to have reason as well.
Well, it's interesting to me, Father, that the people that are already thinking these things and saying these things, I'm not so sure they were alive at the time that Jesus was alive.
Say more. You're not sure that these people here now in the 1st and 2nd century were alive when Jesus was alive.
Right.
They probably weren't.
Right.
So what does that mean?
Well, to make argument, they would have to just base it on their experience.
Their experience and their own beliefs.
And what they,
There you go.
The religious culture that they came from to begin with. And the little that they were taught by the prior generation, the people that were in fact alive when Jesus lived. So it's kind of like they're making it up as they go along.
Yeah. And what we're going to see is that's absolutely fascinating because back at the beginning of Christianity, who were the majority of Christians, as we learn later tonight from Dr. Gonzalez, the majority of Christians weren't learned people like Clement of Alexandria. We were more simple. And so when we heard stories, we call them apocryphal stories, like some of the stories that were not included in the Bible, like the story from St. James. St. James told the great story, the Gospel of James, which is where we get the stories of Joachim and Anna. If you've heard those names, St. Joachim and St. Anna, the parents of Mary, those names come from the Gospel of James. Also in the Gospel of James, it talks about how it was that when the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary, a feather fell off of his wing and touched Mary's belly. And what happened? She became pregnant. You want to know how Mary became pregnant with Jesus? St. James tells us. A feather fell down from the angel's wing and touched Mary's belly. Okay. Well, you just have to believe it, right? You got to have faith. Wait a minute. I know enough about children and childbearing that I know that children don't come from feathers falling off of angels' wings. At least they're not teaching that in biology these days. Right? Watch out for falling wings, for falling feathers, right? So there has to be some element of reason. And as the simple folk that we were during those first centuries, I think, Angelita, you're exactly onto it. We were simple folk who were trying to understand our faith now in the light of reason, because we were being challenged by all these people who were reading philosophers and who were asking us questions about what it was that we believed. Tertullian of Carthage, have we heard the name of Tertullian? Lived from roughly 160 to 220 AD. So Tertullian was a lawyer, which is great. It's going to take us on this different direction, though, of one who understood things more legalistically. He was a lawyer raised in North Africa, so Carthage is in North Africa. Carthage is over in North Africa. He's going to find himself converting to Christianity in Rome at around the age 40, which means that he wasn't Christian all his life. He goes back to Carthage, and he wrote treatises to defend the faith against pagans. What a gift that we now have a lawyer who can argue for us against pagans. Thank you, Tertullian. He was the first Christian theologian to write in Latin. How fascinating, because before then, what was happening? We were part of the Greek Empire before the Romans conquered us. Of course, Latin started off as something we spoke in the western part of the empire, but we were still speaking Greek and defending our faith in Greek. Tertullian's going to be the first one to do so in Latin. Which is why we also refer to him as the founder of Western theology, because, again, Latin was the language of the West, so the Patriarch of the West in Rome was more familiar with Latin than any of these other people would be. Where did those languages in Europe, Italian and French and Spanish, where did they come from? From Latin, principally. So Tertullian wrote a work called Prescription Against the Heretics. Prescription Against the Heretics. When we think of prescription, we think of like something that the doctor gives you to go down to the pharmacy and buy medicine. Is that what he's talking about? No. So actually the word prescription back then had two meanings. One meaning was a legal argument presented before a court case begins to show that a party has no right to sue. Yikes. So if I'm being sued now, the case is going before Judge Angelita. Christopher is suing me. I'm going to write a prescription, which back then meant I'm going to write why it is that Christopher has no right to sue me, so that Judge Angelita can decide, does Christopher have a right to sue in this case? So that was one meaning of prescription. Think about that in relation to the heretics, right? What Tertullian is going to argue is that the heretics have no right to be accusing us of anything. The other meaning of prescription was that a party had undisputed possession of a property for a certain time and becomes the legal owner of it. Sort of like the modern day analogy that comes to mind is that of squatters, right? After you've been on a piece of land so long and no one has said something, then it seems that a person may have some legal right to that land. Okay? So back then, a party had undisputed possession of something for a certain time and became the legal owner of it. What Tertullian is going to argue is, wait a minute, the Bible, the Scriptures, we as Christians have had possession of these since the beginning. Heretics have no right to be using those against us. Those are our Scriptures. So Tertullian argued, heretics don't have the right to dispute with the church or to use the Bible because they can't change what legally belongs to the church. The Scriptures and all of our beliefs, that's ours. The heretics have no right to challenge that. The church, said Tertullian, is the rightful owner of Scriptures, and since we own the Scriptures, it's our job to interpret them. The heretics have no right to interpret our Scriptures. They're our Scriptures. We have the right to interpret them ourselves. And Tertullian was also great because he had great sarcasm. For those of us who read Dr. Gonzalez's work, there's a paragraph in there where it involves his sarcasm and his wit. Because of his wit, his sarcasm, because he wrote so much, he became the scourge of heretics and the champion of orthodoxy, according to Dr. Gonzalez. Right? He was the one who was the voice for the church, for orthodox or right belief. Interesting, Tertullian, though, was a great defender of orthodoxy, and yet what happened in 207, roughly 13 years before his death? Did he stay Orthodox Christian his whole entire life? No. Fascinating, because he became a Montanist. Who were the Montanists then? The Montanists were a group who believed that a new age was dawning where the Spirit was going to be pouring itself into people's hearts and minds, and people are going to be inspired by the Spirit. And so how interesting that Tertullian, this man who was defending the faith, began to believe that the Spirit was going to be speaking through various people. And part of the Montanists, what they do is they demanded a rigorous moral life, including celibacy. That's not a word that we've heard yet in this course. Celibacy. Right? We know that, for instance, in the Roman Catholic Church, celibacy has been important for priests in the Roman Catholic Church for at least the past some number of years. Interesting. We're first hearing that word in church history now in the beginning of the 3rd century. And one of Tertullian's most famous works, Against Praxeas. Interesting, we believe that Praxeas is the name that he was using for Pope Calixtus, which they didn't use the word Pope yet. I put the word Pope in here, but if you remember from Dr. Gonzalez's work, he doesn't use the word Pope. He used the word Bishop of Rome. How interesting. So Calixtus was the Bishop of Rome, but today we know that person as the Pope. So essentially what Tertullian was doing was he was attacking the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, under a fictional name for believing that the Trinity are 3 modes in which God appears. God appears as Father, God appears as Son, and God appears as Holy Spirit. And so Tertullian was the first to go after him and saying, wait a minute, this bishop is teaching something that we cannot believe. That God appears in various modes. He wrote in his works, Praxeas served the devil in Rome. We believe that's why we believe he was talking about the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. He served the devil in Rome in 2 ways. By expelling prophecy. What were the Montanists doing? The Montanists were believing that the Spirit was inspiring people, allowing people to be prophetic. So he expelled them and introduced heresy, evicting the Spirit and crucifying the Father. Evicting the Spirit because the Montanists, were no longer part of the fold. They believed that the Spirit was working in a special way. They were excluded from the church. And crucifying the Father. How is the Father crucified? Well, if you believe that one God appears, one God we believe in, who appears as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We say that the Son was crucified, but if you believe it's one God acting in 3 modes, then it was the Father who was crucified as well. So it was Tertullian who coined phrases like 1 substance and 3 persons. If you said that, or if you believe that if we believe in one God who exists in 3 persons, that language comes from Tertullian. Or he talked about Christ. Christ was one person, had 2 natures. What were Christ's 2 natures? He had a divine nature. Have we heard this before? So Christ had a divine nature. Christ was God. Christ also had a human nature. Christ was human. So the way that Tertullian explained that was that Christ was one person with 2 natures. He had a divine nature and a human nature. He was God and he was human. You okay with Tertullian?
I'm not so okay with Tertullian.
Please.
This was probably the least favorite person covered.
He's a lawyer.
I know.
Oh.
That's right.
Okay. A few lawyer jokes come to mind, but we'll say. So, Angelita, what's the problem?
Well, he's so far out there that my thought of the early church, the first couple of 100 years, is just people that came together and remembered the community as Christ put us together and broke bread and prayed and so forth. Right here, this is the extreme for me, and it's not positive. And the only thing that I can appreciate this man for is, as I understand it, he came up with a concept or solidified the concept of the Trinity, and I'm okay with that.
We're okay with that.
Yeah.
The other side of the path, the other path that he took us down, being a lawyer and being legalistic, was what would happen then. He was in the Western church writing in Latin. All the other fathers and mothers were in the Greek-speaking church. What would happen in the Western church, the Latin church? It would become more legalistic. think about it when it comes to confession, the way that we were all raised, thinking about various sins. This is a mortal sin, this is a venial sin, all these legalistic distinctions. Do we have any of that in the Eastern Church? That's something from the Western Church. And we have the likes of Tertullian to thank for leading us down that path of legalism in the church. Origen of Alexandria. So Origen, we know, is from the same city as Clement. We had Clement of Alexandria before, this city of study, this scholarly city, this center. Origen is going to be from the same city slightly later, from 182 to 254. Interesting, he was not a pagan who converted, like many of those early persons. He was raised by Christian parents. His father was martyred, so imagine that the impact that would have on a person's life when you know that your father gave his life for your faith. Are you going to leave that faith very easily, knowing that your father died for that faith? He became famous for training catechumens. We remember that catechumens were people who were preparing to be baptized. So that was how he became famous. He was in charge of teaching the catechumens. So during our early celebrations of the Mass, we didn't call it Mass then, but during our early celebrations of the Eucharist, when we excused the catechumens, he was the one teaching them, and he was so good at it that all of us in the community just looked at him and said, wow, this kid has talent. So he went from training catechumens to running a school of Christian philosophy. How interesting, taking philosophy and combining it with what we believe as Christians. Interesting though, because the Bishop of Alexandria was so jealous of this young man doing what he was doing that Origen had to flee to Caesarea. So he was here in Alexandria, had to flee to Caesarea, which is closer to Jerusalem, heading in the direction of Jerusalem, where he wrote and taught for 20 years. Under the persecution of Decius, he was tortured so severely that he died shortly after being tortured. They didn't kill him, so he wasn't a martyr. Think about the conundrum that this is going to present us now. Before we had martyrs, who were the people who died for their faith. But what do you do now with a person like Deacon Roy, who suffered and was tortured, like really, really tortured, but didn't die a martyr? That's where we're going to come up with the word confessors. The people who confess the faith and suffer for the faith, even though they weren't martyred per se, they still are people that we're going to hold in high esteem. So Origen, what did he write? He wrote so many things that Dr. Gonzalez says his literary output was enormous. He compiled the Hexapla, which was essentially a book with 6 columns. In the first column was the Hebrew scriptures in Hebrew. Can any of us here read Hebrew? Have you ever seen Hebrew characters? No? So essentially the second column was a transliteration, which was essentially how to pronounce the Hebrew. So for instance in English, he was doing it in Greek, but a transliteration would be us in English hearing someone say the Hebrew word and trying to write it in English letters. That's what he was doing in Greek letters. So the first column was the Hebrew scriptures, second column was the transliteration into Greek, and then the other 4 columns were 4 different translations, so that a person could compare the translations with the transliteration and with the original Hebrew. That would have been a pretty fascinating work to read if we had understood Greek. Dr. Gonzalez says that he simultaneously dictated 7 works to 7 secretaries. Let's put that into perspective for a moment. That's like saying, okay, all of us here on this side of the room, I'm going to try writing 7 books. If you could write a book on sacraments, you'll write a book on against heresies, you'll write a book on churches, and we're going to try writing 7 different books at the same time. Are you ready? Get your quills ready. Right? Sharpen your quills. I'll try dictating 7 books, says Dr. Gonzalez, that he dictated 7 books at the same time. Okay, what paragraph did we leave off on that book? Okay, the next paragraph for that work is Origen advocated for 2 creations. Say what? That creation didn't happen once but twice. Where would you get an idea like this? Have you read the Bible?
Yeah, right.
Genesis chapters 1 and Genesis chapter 2. How many stories of creation are in the Bible? There are 2 different stories. If you read the first 2 chapters of the Bible, there are 2 different creation stories, and they're different. Origen knew that. There are two different stories in Genesis, in chapters 1 and chapter 2. So how do we explain two different stories? The way that he explained it is he said, well, the first one must have been a spiritual creation, and the second one was a material creation. He said, look at the words even. In Genesis chapter 1, the word that it uses that God created certain things, so maybe he created them in a sort of spiritual way. In Genesis 2, there are words like God formed or God shaped, so that must have been more material. As Christians, we don't believe that there were two creations, but it was an early thinker trying to wrap his mind around how it is that the Bible could say something like this. How interesting, Dr. Gonzalez also points out that Origen sometimes appears more Platonist than Christian, simply meaning he knew Platonic philosophy, he knew the philosophy of Plato, and sometimes that shines through a lot more than Christianity. What were some of the things that Plato believed in? Things like the pre-existence of souls, that your soul has existed way long before it joined your body. That was a Platonic idea.